Before there was Marvel vs. Capcom, before there was even X-Men vs. Street Fighter, there was, well, X-Men Children of the Atom, the 1994 arcade fighting game that began a long line of Capcom-developed fighters featuring Marvel superheroes, and would eventually lead to people swearing up and down that these games are the greatest thing since sliced bread. I wholeheartedly disagree with that assessment. The greatest thing since sliced bread happens to be a sandwich, especially sandwiches toasted in an oven. That has... never mind. X-Men Children of the Atom didn't have such grandiose visions at the time the game was being developed and released into stuff. It just aimed to be a fast-paced, action-packed fighting game that just so happens to lay the basic groundworks for all future Marvel fighters to be based around. And even to this day, when there are sequels with much larger rosters available and more refined elements in their gameplay, this initial Capcom outing remains a fun outing, managing to offer that high-quality, intense one-on-one fighting game while adapting it perfectly to the super-powered stylings of X-Men with plenty of spectacular powers and eye-popping artwork to boot. So, yeah, home ports. Let's talk about that for a bit. X-Men Children of the Atom was released for the Sega Saturn in 1996, while Sony PlayStation owners got their slice of the X-Men pie in 1998, and distributed by Acclaim. Uh-oh. So here's the deal. X-Men Children of the Atom gives you 10 playable characters to choose from, each with their own set of special moves, special abilities, and super hyper X ultra moves, or whatever they used to call them back in the day. You know, the usual Capcom stuff. Compared to Capcom's prior fighting games before X-Men, the levels were larger in scope, allowing fighters to jump really, really high, something they like to call super jumps, I guess, or break the ground with throws to reach a lower level of the battlefield. Levels actually have different events taking place depending on who comes out the victor. Just a lot of neat little touches that were mostly transited over to the home conversion. There's only 2 modes of play in Children of the Atom for the PlayStation. Your standard issue arcade mode, where you'll fight 6 random opponents before challenging the final bosses of the game, the Juggernaut and Magneto. Naturally, they being bosses, they are tough bastards that will kick your ass at first. Not quite SNK boss syndrome or whatever the vernacular happens to be, but still pretty difficult fare even on the easier settings. But otherwise they're beatable. And then there's the versus mode, which is your standard 2-player versus mode. Nothing too special there. And because this is Capcom and they like to do this sort of thing, especially in the old days, they recycled Akuma from Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo and hid him in this game, so you can either challenge him under certain conditions or put in a code to access him. It's a rather nice Easter egg for the time at least. Control in Children of the Atom is somewhat adequate for the most part. Suffice it to say, if you played any Capcom fighter, you'll be able to figure out some special moves easily because it's the typical quarter circle, half circle, 360 circles, the usual joystick motion button press combo things to perform these moves. Response time is somewhat good when it comes to really quick and simple button presses, but I found that you generally have to take your time when performing the special moves because they tend to not work at times when you do them really fast. So, you know, if you try to put in a Dragon Punch type motion really fast, or even a Fireball motion really fast, half the time it won't register, so you really have to slow down a bit and take your time when inputting these button combinations. You see, the big problem with X-Men Children of the Atom on the Sony PlayStation, perhaps the fatal attraction to this version of the game, is the constant slowdown that just so happens to plague every single aspect of this version of X-Men. The opening cinema is slow. The select screen is slow. The combat is as sluggish as molasses, and even navigating through the options menu feels slow. It's almost as if this game was designed to be as slow and plodding as inhumanly possible, and if that were the case, they've succeeded tremendously. I can understand that the PlayStation is probably not that much of a powerhouse. It's been said that when it comes to 2D fighting games, the Sega Saturn is much better equipped to handle those type of games. Of course, I don't own a Sega Saturn, so I can't really say if that's truly the case. But 2D fighters have been done on the PlayStation and done rather well. Hell, Marvel Superheroes is nowhere near as sluggish as this game, and that came out in 1997 despite being a sequel of sorts to Children of the Atom, so I really don't know what happened there. I blame Acclaim. That's all I could really do. So, moving right along. X-Men Children of the Atom sported a rather distinctive art style for the time, and was actually visually impressive stuff back in the day. So visually impressive that they recycled the characters from this game for another decade in about 500 sequels or so. In all seriousness though, the original arcade game had smooth, fluid animation that almost seems like it had been ripped out of the comic books of the time. It's really that impressive, what with the character art and the level backdrops and all that jazz. In many ways, Children of the Atom, in my opinion at least, was a much more visually spectacular game than Capcom's later fighting game Street Fighter Alpha. The levels were bigger and grander in scope, the characters were more detailed and felt more lively, special attacks were more visually spectacular. It was truly a sight to behold that first time going in back in 1994 and 1995, and even today I still feel that some of the visuals in this game holds up rather well. The arcade original at least. Unfortunately, the slow, sluggish nature of this PlayStation port ruins any good qualities that could be admired with the artwork, as the animation comes off as choppy as a result and doesn't flow anywhere near as smoothly as one would like. This is especially evident when two larger characters are on screen at the same time, and the game really slows to a near literal crawl. It's a kind of issue that would plague a number of 2D fighters on the PlayStation 1, but some of those games found some way to disguise the fact and optimize the gameplay so that it was fast and slick, which ultimately made the game look good by proxy. Obviously, nothing of the sort was done here. Just about the only thing that this port does well is sound. The game's tunes are actually of decent quality for the most part. There's a nice little bit where you can actually pop the game disc into a CD player and listen to the tunes like a regular music CD for anyone who's into that sort of thing. It's not a bad idea, although music skips quite a bit if the disc is badly scratched or something, and it's a bit of a hassle to listen to when you're playing the game. Sound effects and voice clips sound alright, they're nice and clear, nothing special, but that's okay, it's not a big deal. Sounds alright. Okay, let me just get something out of the way here. I happen to like X-Men Children of the Atom. While I don't think it's the best of the Marvel fighters, it's one that I like playing on MAME every so often whenever I get bothered to fire the damn thing up, that is. That has to tell you something when I have an actual physical copy of a PlayStation conversion of the game readily available on my shelf, and I end up playing the MAME version of the game that's lying around on the hard drive and takes me several clicks to get to because that version ends up playing much better than the PlayStation version. X-Men on the PlayStation is a game that could have been a good port in the hands of those who knew what they were doing, but instead ended up being a painful rendition by those who didn't have a clue. It's a bit fun to try out at first for the novelty of it, for a lark. But once the novelty washes off, you're left with a game that is not only too limited to be enjoyed for any long-term period of time, but is also too slow and sluggish that a port probably should not have been attempted. It's a damn shame because I really wanted to like this game despite its shortcomings. Alas, it was not to be. Bottom line, if you're into Marvel vs. Capcom or that type of game, a fighting game, you want to try the game that really started it all without resorting to MAME emulation, this PlayStation conversion is probably not the best way to go. I'd say go find yourself a Sega Saturn and get that version instead, since apparently that's a much better version.